On the 11th of September 1973, the Chilean armed forces, as led by the Chilean military officer Augusto Pinochet, led a military coup against the socialist government of Salvador Allende, with the backing of the United States. The coup was initiated in response to Allende's assault on Chilean business and American corporate interests, as Allende's government initiated the nationalization of major industries, expropriated agricultural land from prominent landowners, and oversaw broader worker-orientated socialist policies. The diminishment of Chile's capitalist elite, coupled with the threat to American corporate interests, led various Chilean and American corporations to lobby for direct US-backed intervention against the Allende government as retribution for challenging global capitalist hegemony. Whilst the coup not only led to the overthrow of the Allende government, the establishment of a military dictatorship, and the restoration of Chilean and American business interests, it also marked the birth of a new form of capitalism, distinct from its industrial and Fordist predecessors. This economic model, theorized by American economists at the University of Chicago, became known as Neoliberalism, making Chile the first country to undergo large-scale experimentation with radical free market policies. This transformation entailed mass privatization, market deregulation, cuts to social welfare, and unrestrained financial globalization under an authoritarian regime. The US-trained Chilean economists, commonly referred to as the Chicago Boys, ultimately turned Chile into a testing ground of neoliberal theories, which would later be cemented and adopted by the United States, the United Kingdom, and various other countries across the globe, all to varying extents. Although the onset of neoliberalism is to be found in the political violence and anti-democratic authoritarian tendencies of Pinochet's military junta, the theories behind such an economic model are paradoxically framed as liberal, progressive, and aimed towards the fulfillment of human flourishing. As the British-American Marxist scholar David Harvey declares of neoliberalism in his notable 2005 book titled A Brief History of Neoliberalism, that neoliberalism is, in the first instance, a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. The role of the state is to create and preserve an institutional framework appropriate to such practices. The state has to guarantee, for example, the quality and integrity of money. It must also set up those military, defense, police, and legal structures and functions required to secure private property rights and to guarantee, by force if need be, the proper functioning of markets. According to Harvey's definition of neoliberalism, free markets, free trade, and private property rights appear to be the foundational pillars of human prosperity and societal wealth creation. In this system, the state is expected to primarily serve and preserve the interests and hegemony of the free market within a given society, ensuring that all human activities align with and proliferate market values as closely as possible. For Harvey, whilst neoliberalism typically aligns itself with liberal characteristics, corporate state coercion and violence remain central to maintaining market order, highlighting the authoritarian tendencies that can emerge in times of crisis within neoliberal regimes and ensuring that class-based discrepancies are preserved in societies that might otherwise be considered democratic. In emphasizing neoliberalism's austere and disciplinary structure towards the maximization of the free market, Harvey declares that the process of neoliberalization has, however, entailed much creative destruction, not only of prior institutional frameworks and powers, but also of divisions of labor, social relations, welfare provisions, technological mixes, ways of life and thought, reproductive activities, attachments to the land and habits of the heart. Insofar as neoliberalism values market exchange as an ethic in itself, capable of acting as a guide to all human action, and substituting for all previously held ethical beliefs, it emphasizes the significance of contractual relations in the marketplace. It holds that the social good will be maximized by maximizing the reach and frequency of market transactions, and it seeks to bring all human action into the domain of the market. For the American political theologian Adam Kotzko, neoliberalism extends far beyond mere patterns of governance and control, as it crucially encompasses entire worldviews and perceptions of reality, from which he states that neoliberal ideology is a form of theology. It is a discourse that aims to reshape the world. For Kotzko, neoliberalism legitimizes itself through hyper-individualistic notions of the self and freedom, elevating market competition as the highest form of human liberty and actualization. Through reshaping the world as a mere stage for the actions of seemingly rational economic agents, neoliberalism supplants former theological modes of thought, placing its faith in the unquestionable logic of the free market as the ultimate guiding force of human civilizational order. Other philosophical definitions and explanations of neoliberalism, as articulated by the likes of the French philosopher Michel Foucault and the American political theorist Wendy Brown, focus more so on the biopolitical techniques and modes of governance that shape individual behavior and societal norms on the scale of populations that enable the structure of neoliberalism to function efficiently without question to its hegemonic apparatus. By contrast, the Canadian historian Quinn Slobodian shifts greater attentions towards international institutions such as the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund that sanction neoliberalism to function on a global interconnected scale beyond the parameters of any one particular nation-state. Since its practical inception, neoliberalism has manifested across numerous societies, taking root in both democratic and authoritarian political systems, and often blurring the distinctions between these two poles. Despite its varied expressions, recurring patterns of neoliberal regimes across the world include mass commodification and consumerism, relentless resource extraction and consumption, pronounced wealth inequality, class hierarchies, poverty, waste, the proliferation of non-places, bloated centers of financial concentration, and the erosion of public services, spaces, and societal protections, ultimately reshaping societies around the interests of global capital. In contrast to neoliberal discourse promoting trickle-down economics, market competition, individual responsibility, economic progress, and faith in the invisible hand of the free market, sociologist Stephen L. Muzzatti argues in the foreword to the 2019 book, The Violence of Neoliberalism, Crime, Harm, and Inequality, that neoliberalism is not only undermining economies worldwide, but also exerting profound psychological and physiological harm on those living under its influence. This regressive distress, he contends, cultivates frustration, resentment, and cynical feelings, giving rise to a new form of modern barbarism, one that nevertheless reflects and reinforces the competitive, hyper-individualistic, and punitive values underlying free market, neoliberal capitalism. As he states that, neoliberalism is in the process of turning us all into degenerates. Despite considerable evidence of an epidemic of pathological narcissism, the truth is that we hate ourselves and we hate each other. Neoliberalism's mass sensibility was forged in a fantasy world of venture capitalism, hyper-wealth, and unlimited personal and natural resources. People are detached from reality, frustrated, anxious, and lack any true sense of community or solidarity. In lieu of any real spiritual, emotional, and political connections to other people, we seek out other forms of social meaning and belonging. Most of these hinge on a rank, dog-eat-dog individualism and fortress mentality, and are at best disruptive, if not outright destructive, certainly pathological, and often inherently contradictory. The malaise of neoliberalism is a population characterized by total cynicism, no opinions, except as they relate to the incontrovertibly mundane, no hope, a sense of entitlement, hopelessness, unrealistic expectations, giddiness, melancholia, overconfidence, and insecurity. According to Muzzatti, the dehumanized and debilitated state of human subjectivity under neoliberal capitalism generates pathologies that oscillate between nihilism, entitlement, and despair, forming docile, self-centered, and cynical subjects that endure and resent their condition. Unable to forge meaningful connections with others or the earth, neoliberal subjectivity erodes spiritual, emotional, and political connections of solidarity, supplanting them with individualized survival strategies in a hyper-competitive society shaped by artificial scarcity. In all such cases, this alienated, resentful, and precarious condition of subjectivity is necessary for the functioning and operating of neoliberal capitalism itself, and its reproduction of consumer desire. As Muzzatti reaffirms, our bodies, minds, and souls are daily poisoned by the carcinogens of neoliberalism. We buy stuff that we do not need, with money that we do not have, until we throw it away and buy some new stuff, and then repeat. We resent those around us, seeing them as the competition, not our brothers and sisters. We despise those below us, characterizing them as undeserving of help or even sympathy, unless, of course, it serves some important self-aggrandizing end, such as highlighting our own virtue, empathy, and commitment to social justice. We also hate those above us, rhetorically framing them as Machiavellian plutocrats, but it does not stop us from secretly wanting, and sometimes a little less secretly, getting a little piece of what they have in the form of luxury. And every day it gets worse. It becomes more toxic and more dangerous. The immiseration of the human condition under neoliberal capitalism in the 21st century is, however, by no means an anomaly or the result of a modern economic system corrupted by illiberal, oligarchic, and fascist actors. Rather, as examined in the writings of Austrian-British political philosopher Friedrich Hayek, who is widely considered as one of the godfathers of neoliberal theory, cruelty, punishment, disposability, and societal verticality are not aberrations but essential mechanisms for maintaining market order and the broader disciplinary project of neoliberal capitalism. Indeed, as influenced by the 19th century British philosopher and evolutionary theorist Herbert Spencer and American sociologist William Graham Sumner, both of whom espoused varying degrees of social Darwinism and biological determinism, which would later lay the groundworks for the 20th century eugenicist movements, Friedrich Hayek incorporated their evolutionary principles into his broader economic and socio-political thought. From this influence, Hayek adopted the perspective that the free market functions as an evolutionary system, where the fittest economic structures and institutions not only thrive and produce wealth, but also determine the strong among humanity, whilst less efficient ones inevitably wither away, revealing the weaker strains of humanity. Although Hayek sought to distance himself from the social Darwinism embedded in Western imperialism, eugenics, fascism, and Nazism, many critics argue that significant aspects of his broader philosophy overlap with social Darwinist thought. In this framework, the evolutionary struggle once tied to race and/or civilization in social Darwinism is replaced by an evolutionary struggle in the competition between economic structures and systems. Such an economic order, composed of decentralized interactions between rational economic agents, emerges in much the same way a biological organism develops into an adaptive self-organizing system, cultivating a complex structure governed by its own internal epistemic decision-making processes, which further necessitates protection from external influences to maintain its structural integrity. Hayek greatly admired Darwin's theory of evolution, not because it could or should be imported directly into social science, but because it was one of the best examples of pattern prediction in science. It uncovered not laws, but a general pattern. Hayek argued that this was the standard which economics and the other social sciences, which sought to be theoretical, had to match. They too were studying organisms, which evolved, but in this case the organisms were made up of a vast number of individuals, and the interactions between them and the order that resulted could only be explained by understanding the nature of human action, and how coordination of the plans of myriad individuals depended upon them following abstract rules of conduct, which had arisen in a process of group selection because of the fragmented and limited nature of their knowledge. In its distortion of Darwin's theories, Hayek's broader philosophy reflects the 20th century zeitgeist of social Darwinist thought, driven by a desire to master society and legitimize economic models that prioritized a wealthy elite over and against the masses. Framed in materialist and evolutionary terms, his ideas provided a framework for distinguishing between productive and unproductive populations, reinforcing economic class-based hierarchies under the guise of natural selection. For the current day, the enduring legacies of Hayekian neoliberalism are most pronounced in the increasing free market supremacy over politics and society, corporate and financial globalization, societal hyper-individualism, austerity, and the decline of social welfare, labor rights, and environmental protections, all of which are contributing to the sense that neoliberal capitalism is producing survival of the fittest, eugenic-like effects for the global working class in the 21st century. In Hayek's understanding of societal progress under capitalism, enduring economic inequalities and wealth disparities are not explicit injustices underlying the capitalist system, but rather temporary stages of process and development, as the wealth of those above the masses will spearhead the way for those below, as wealthy exemplars for the masses to aspire towards, which will ultimately follow in increased social mobility. Inequality, therefore, is inseparable to societal progress. As such, stratification will empower the working masses towards greater levels of productivity and rational economic choices in the overcoming of their current working class condition. The seemingly unavoidable and inevitable existence of inequality requires that there must always be leaders and followers, as archetypes towards the furtherance of wealth production in a given society that is otherwise prone to regressive tendencies under egalitarian incentives. As Hayek describes, in a progressive society, the comparatively wealthy are merely somewhat ahead of the rest in the material advantages they enjoy. They are already living in a phase of evolution that the others have not yet reached. Poverty has, in consequence, become a relative rather than an absolute concept. This does not make it less bitter. Most of what we strive for are things we want because others already have them. Yet, a progressive society, while it relies on this process of learning and imitation, recognizes the desires it creates only as a spur to further effort. It disregards the pain of unfulfilled desire aroused by the example of others. It appears cruel because it increases the desire of all, in proportion as it increases its gifts to some. Yet, so long as it remains a progressive society, some must lead and the rest must follow. From Hayek's perspective, poverty within modern capitalist hierarchies, having largely overcome limitations of scarcity, should no longer be understood in absolute terms of widespread deprivation and impoverishment, but rather in relativity to the wealth of others. The human ability to recognize one's lower position within the capitalist socio-economic order, as expressed through envy and desire, is not, according to Hayek, a flaw to be remedied through public consensus and egalitarian measures, but rather a psychological force to be harnessed and acted upon, driving individuals to pursue wealth creation, which in turn contributes to broader economic growth and societal progress. For Hayek, whilst this system appears cruel in its disregard for the suffering and resentment caused by societal verticality and unfulfilled desires, he views it as a necessary driver and impetus of progress, which ultimately distinguishes those capable of overcoming their material conditions, accumulating wealth, and contributing to societal advancement. By perceiving societal inequality and poverty as inconsequential, Hayek characterizes the market order as an impersonal mechanism that continuously selects and renews the successful members of society from the unsuccessful, guaranteeing that the market distributes resources most effectively to those who are most viable at sustaining wealth production. For Hayek, this process of natural selection creates the greatest abundance for all and propels societal progress at all costs, from which any attempts to regulate and interfere with such mechanisms of progress will result in cascading decline for all members of a given society. All our hopes for the reduction of misery and poverty rest on this expectation of progress. If we abandon progress, we should also have to abandon all those social improvements that we now hope for, all the desired advances in education and health, the realization of our wish that at least a large proportion of the people should reach the goals for which they are striving, depend on the continuance of progress. We have only to remember that to prevent progress at the top would soon prevent it all the way down. The aspirations of the great mass of the world's population can today be satisfied only by rapid material progress, the peace of the world, and with it, civilization itself, thus depend on continued progress at a fast rate. At this juncture, we are therefore not only the creatures but the captives of progress. Even if we wished to, we could not sit back and enjoy at leisure what we have achieved. Our task must be to continue to lead, to move ahead along the path which so many more are trying to tread in our wake. The notion of progress, according to Hayek, is not a discourse to be disputed or considered, but rather a responsibility to be fulfilled and pursued at any cost for the furtherance of human prosperity and civilization itself, which can only seemingly decline if progress is forestalled. Drawing notably from his social Darwinian influences, Hayek proclaims that the complex global market order is the historical outcome of thousands of years of successful selective habits, practices, and patterns across human civilization. These practices, he argues, have enabled the survival and prosperity of groups that adhere to them, cultivating the development of institutions and economic structures that reflect these long-standing adaptive behaviors. The prominence and hegemony of capitalism is also to be attributed with this historical evolutionary process of selection, as Hayek justifies the superiority of capitalism over socialism on the grounds that it has been able to expand and multiply human populations beyond the limits of pre-modern societal organizations. As he declares, life exists only so long as it provides for its own continuance. Whatever men live for, today most live only because of the market order. We have become civilized by the increase of our numbers, just as civilization made that increase possible. We can be few and savage, or many and civilized. If reduced to its population of 10,000 years ago, mankind could not preserve civilization. So many people already exist, and only a market economy can keep the bulk of them alive. Because of the rapid transfer of information, men everywhere now know what high standards of living are possible. Most of those who live in some more thinly settled places can hope to reach such standards only by multiplying and settling their regions more densely, so increasing even further the numbers that can be kept alive by a market economy. Without making any explicit moral value judgment, Hayek aligns human biological reproduction, multiplication, and continuation with the existence of capitalism and the free market, which allows him to suggest that any interference with or proposals for alternatives to the market order pose a threat to the very survival of human life and civilization. In this sense, capitalism and the free market, regardless of their actual effects on human life, are hailed as the exceptional product of evolutionary history, imitating selective evolutionary processes and driving the self-organizing continuation of evolution itself. Subsequently, regulations to the market and alternative economic models are considered counter-evolutionary, providing ideological justification to resist government intervention, dismantle social safety nets, and delegitimize economic systems that prioritize collective welfare over market competition. Moreover, by employing a biopolitical rationality, Hayek invokes an evolutionary logic as derived from social Darwinist principles, which frames competition, adaptation, and the survival of the fittest as naturalizing forces shaping human societal arrangement. Within this framework, wealth inequalities, class hierarchies, and market competition are not seen as historically contingent human designs, but rather as the inevitable and necessary byproducts of an evolutionary process that selects for efficiency, innovation, and resilience. In the 21st century, entrepreneurial and business figures ranging from Elon Musk to Peter Thiel and Jeff Bezos have all actively stressed the seemingly innate evolutionary properties that determine the proliferation of the free market and its societal order. For the scholar Naomi Beck, Hayek was not only theoretically indebted to the social Darwinism of the 19th century, but further indebted to and actively involved in the social Darwinist discourses of his time. In this context, Beck identifies the influence of 20th century British sociobiologists Alexander Carr Sanders and Julian Huxley, both of whom were actively involved in the eugenics movement and had close associations with Hayek. Notably, their socio-biological evolutionary thought, which related eugenics to the possibilities of population control and socio-economic planning, played a defining role in shaping Hayek's philosophy of cultural and economic evolution, as Beck reaffirms of Hayek's relation to Carl Sanders, that, in order to explain the shift from a small group morality, governed by instinctual responses, to a market morality geared toward expansion, Hayek called on the idea of group selection. He first became acquainted with this notion through Alexander Carl Sanders's The Population Problem, which he quoted practically each time he discussed cultural evolution. The two men also knew each other personally. Carl Sanders was nominated director of the London School of Economics, while Hayek held a professorship there. A series of letters indicates that they also read each other's writings. This, however, did not prevent Hayek from taking Carl Sanders's theory and turning it on its head, in order for it to suit his own account of cultural evolution. In contrast to the state-led eugenic orientation of Carl Sanders and Huxley, who both perceived planned intervention into the biological composition of a given population as necessary for enhancing their productivity, Hayek emphasized the spontaneous ordering of natural selection, which occurs as a decentralized process and does not require planned state-led initiatives to derive outcomes favorable to a market order. Furthermore, whilst Carl Sanders and Huxley adhered to hereditary biological determinism, viewing class hierarchies as a consequence of specific genetic traits and selections, Hayek rejected this perspective. Instead, he proposed that cultural evolution, shaped by habits, rules, traditions, customs, and institutions, rather than biological inheritance, was the driving force behind societal advancement and evolutionary progress. As Hayek declares, the social sciences imported ideas from biology and with them brought in such conceptions as natural selection, struggle for existence, and survival of the fittest, which are not appropriate in their field. For in social evolution, the decisive factor is not the selection of the physical and inheritable properties of the individuals, but the selection by imitation of successful institutions and habits. Though this operates also through the success of individuals and groups, what emerges is not an inheritable attribute of individuals, but ideas and skills. In short, the whole cultural inheritance, which is passed on by learning and imitation. In this sense, cultural evolution operates under different principles and mechanisms that cannot be solely reduced to mere biological explanations. For Hayek, cultural evolution takes place on a faster plane and accounts more so for the accumulated knowledge and customs of groups rather than the inherited genetic traits of specific individuals, as he reaffirms that cultural evolution is, as Julian Huxley justly stated, a process differing radically from biological evolution, with its own laws and mechanisms and modalities, and not capable of explanation on purely biological grounds. Moreover, cultural evolution is brought about through transmission of habits and information, not merely from the individual's physical parents, but from an indefinite number of ancestors. The processes furthering the transmission and spreading of cultural properties by learning also, as already noted, make cultural evolution incomparably faster than biological evolution. According to Beck, Hayek had an incomplete grasp of Darwinian evolutionary theory and was more closely aligned with the ideas of the 18th century French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Unlike Darwin, who emphasized random genetic mutations as the driver of evolution, Lamarck argued that organisms acquire and pass on traits through direct adaptation to their environment. Hayek's inclination toward a form of cultural Lamarckism is evident in his view that societal evolution is propelled by learned and transmitted behaviors, customs, and habits rather than random genetic mutations. His divergence from sociobiology can also be understood within the context of the post-war era, as Hayek sought to distance himself from the overtly racialized and deterministic strands of social Darwinism that had fueled white supremacy, fascism, and Nazism in the early to mid-20th century. In Hayek's mind, the proponents of sociobiology, as well as the pioneer figures in the fascinating study of ethology, all fell prey to the same mistake. They too rapidly applied the conclusions drawn from the observation of animals to the explanation of human conduct, and focused on genetic selection while neglecting the decisively important selective evolution of rules and practices. According to Beck, Hayek, however, did not entirely break with the social Darwinist tendencies he sought to distance himself from. as Hayek's own cultural evolutionary theory remained grounded in the notion that life has no purpose beyond its own continuation, positioning human reproduction and population growth as fundamental measures of cultural and societal evolution. This reliance on biological functions as determinant of evolutionary value ultimately aligns Hayek more closely with the reductionist and deterministic logic of social Darwinist thought than he explicitly acknowledged. As Beck reaffirms, Hayek's effort to explain why we are constrained to preserve capitalism reduced cultural evolution to a process of population growth that depends on free competition for its material foundation. He relied on grand statements, such as life has no purpose but itself. Life exists only so long as it provides for its own continuance. This reductionist mode of reasoning points yet again to an understanding of evolution that is more in tune with the social Darwinism Hayek criticized than with modern views. Recall that Hayek reproached the social Darwinists for their over-reliance on biology in the explanation of human morality. Hayek himself fell into the reductionist trap when he made growth and reproductive success the main ethical values and goals of evolution, both biological and cultural. Hayek's inability to further escape the ensnarement of social Darwinism is further reflected in his understanding of liberalism in relation to the establishment of societal hierarchies, which underlie the deeply illiberal character of Hayek's liberalism, or what would later be considered neoliberalism and libertarianism, in contrast to conservatism and/or neoconservatism, which seeks to preserve established class hierarchies through employing mechanisms of the state outside of the free market. Hayek suggests that market forces will determine ruling elites based on their ability to nurture market utility for the greatest number of people. This automated blind mechanism of selection seemingly overlooks racial, ethnic, gender, and class-based differences, focusing solely on entrepreneurial qualities above inherited characteristics. Nevertheless, Hayek's perception of meritocracy ultimately provides credence to the possibility of a superior peoples, as he declares that the liberal, of course, does not deny that there are some superior people. He is not an egalitarian, but he denies that anyone has authority to decide who these superior people are, while the conservative inclines to defend a particular established hierarchy and wishes authority to protect the status of those whom he values. The liberal feels that no respect for established values can justify the resort to privilege or monopoly or any other coercive power of the state in order to shelter such people against the forces of economic change. In Hayek's Western-centric perspective, the market order is portrayed as a universal, objective, and meritocratic system that transcends the limitations of other economic models throughout history, as Hayek viewed free market capitalism as the pinnacle of economic evolution, distinguishing it from systems that have historically been shaped by tribal, ethnic, regional, and religious in-group dynamics, and limited by pre-modern particularistic constraints. By contrast, the market order, through its reliance on spontaneous selection, individual choice, and competition, is seen as inherently capable of promoting a more expansive and universal economic environment. Therefore, free market capitalism is not only an outcome of a seemingly long evolutionary process, but a penultimate culmination in human history that has enabled human civilization to rise above pre-modern limiting factors, positioning the market as a force that conjures expansion, progress, and prosperity for all humans across the globe on a universal basis. Notably, Hayek strongly criticized the economic alternatives of socialism and/or communism, arguing that their focus on achieving greater egalitarianism in a worker-based, state-orientated society was fundamentally opposed to the human project of civilization and the dynamic principles of the free market, such as universality, liberty, meritocracy, decentralization, and progress. For Hayek, these alternative models would ultimately restrict the spontaneity and dynamism of market forces, leading to regressive tendencies in society and the potential collapse of human civilization itself. Hayek's opposition to socialism and communism was also rooted in his analysis of the failures of 20th century revolutionary communist regimes, particularly the Soviet Union and Maoist China, which he saw as clear demonstrations to the inherent flaws in state-led centralized planning, collectivization, forced egalitarianism, and authoritarianism. By the same token, any form of egalitarian societal justice for Hayek was considered a mirage of justice that was supposedly impossible to define or achieve, as all forms of justice to be conceived outside of the spontaneous ordering of the market were designated as artificial impositions that could only lead to statism and totalitarianism. As the American political theorist Wendy Brown reaffirms of Hayek's position that social justice, then, is an overdetermined object of opprobrium for Hayek. It draws on the fatal conceit of society and attempts to replace the hierarchy and freedom of market and moral conduct with designs imposed by states. It submits morality to rational standards and confuses justice with outcomes rather than rules. It destroys the spontaneous order, justice, freedom, and civilizational development, secured by markets and morals, with a totalitarian statism. Despite the free market's claim to universality and progress, Hayek acknowledges that its selection mechanisms are not without hardship, from which he suggests that certain disciplinary forces, viewed as inevitable rather than unjust, are necessary to expunge unproductive habits, subjectivities, and ways of life that fail to contribute to the wealth of society. These forces, whether taking the form of economic precarity, social exclusion, or psychological resentment, function as mechanisms of adaptation, ensuring that individuals and groups align themselves with the demands of market efficiency and productivity. To establish self-disciplinary subjects, therefore, who will reproduce the conditions required for free market capitalism to thrive, varying degrees of pain, punishment, and repression of pleasure are deemed necessary for the continuation of the market order. In the context of Michel Foucault's philosophy, Western modernity has produced dueling but ultimately overlapping operations of power that focus on the human body as a biological organism to be analyzed, experimented, and modulated so as to align human existence to modern regimes of life centered upon the rationality of a capitalist social order. For Foucault, these distinguished but interwoven operations are the disciplinary and biopolitical modes of power that crucially aim to impose and produce the same effects and structures of knowledge upon bodies at the scale of entire populations. Human life, therefore, becomes an object of scientific governance, shaped by techniques of surveillance, regulation, and normalization that generate and disseminate knowledge throughout a vast network of modern institutions. As Foucault reaffirms, from the 18th century onward, we have then two technologies of power which were established at different times and which were superimposed. One technique is disciplinary. It centers on the body, produces individualizing effects, and manipulates the body as a source of forces that have to be rendered both useful and docile. And we also have a second technology, which is centered not upon the body, but upon life. A technology which brings together the mass effects characteristic of a population, which tries to control the series of random events that can occur in a living mass. A technology which tries to predict the probability of those events, or at least to compensate for their effects. Both technologies are obviously technologies of the body, but one is a technology in which the body is individualized as an organism endowed with capacities, while the other is a technology in which bodies are replaced by general biological processes. In the period of late modernity, Foucault argues that these two forms of power not only persist but intensify, coexisting and reinforcing one another, as disciplinary power molds individuals into obedient, productive citizens, whilst biopolitical governance monitors and regulates the conditions necessary for sustaining and optimizing life itself at the scale of entire populations. Although Hayek was not directly influenced by Foucault, his broader economic philosophy aligns with the biopolitical rationalities that shaped national governance in the 20th century, as his vision of the free market is deeply intertwined with notions of survival, reproduction, breeding, and discipline, reflecting a framework in which market competition, serves as the driving mechanism for regulating human existence. Competition is as much a method for breeding certain types of mind as anything else. The very cast of thinking of the great entrepreneurs would not exist but for the environment in which they developed their gifts. The same innate capacity to think will take a wholly different turn according to the task it is set. Throughout Hayek's writings, the market is also frequently described as an information processing mechanism that spontaneously self-organizes, self-aggregates, and self-disciplines a given society based on the decentralized distribution of knowledge. This knowledge, emerging from the interactions of individuals rather than central planning, governs worker efficiency, wealth production, and the allocation of resources, all whilst regulating ruptures and forces that do not align with the productive equilibrium of the market. For example, if certain economic activities become unproductive or unsustainable, such as an overproduction of certain commodities, a new technological innovation replaces an outdated one, or workers go on strike, the knowledge of the market system signals for their reduction or expulsion, thereby maintaining overall strict market stability and adaptability within a decentralized capitalist system. Hayek describes this sufficient coordination of market knowledge and power to a cybernetic feedback loop cycle, from which he declares that an inseparable part of the steering mechanism of the market is the manner in which the cybernetic principle of negative feedback operates to maintain the order of the market. It is only through such changes which indicate that some activities ought to be reduced, that the efforts of all can be continuously adjusted to a greater variety of facts than can be known to any one person or agency, and that the utilization of dispersed knowledge is achieved on which the well-being of the Great Society rests. The notion of the Great Society directly addresses the interlocking hegemony of market signals and decision-making, which not only dictates which enterprises and behaviors flourish and thrive, but also imposes disciplinary pressures that shape individuals into efficient, adaptive participants who conform to the fluctuations of the broader market order. Crucial to this process of societal engineering, according to Hayek, is the servitude and submission of the masses to market forces, without which the spontaneous ordering and progress that defines a seemingly free society would come apart, hindering the very pillars of civilization that emerge from the decision-making and adaptive behaviors of individuals in response to market signals. In Hayek's understanding of the human relation to the market, he asserts that the adherence and submission to market forces is not a modern phenomenon, but one that can be traced back to ancient civilizations. In these early societies, such submission was often grounded in irrational and superstitious beliefs, where individuals and communities, guided by religious or metaphysical convictions, accepted the inner workings of market forces as something beyond their immediate control. For Hayek, however, these irrational and superstitious beliefs about the market, which created subservient and compliant economic conditions, formed the essential foundations for transitioning to a more rationally accepted market order, viewing this shift as a necessary sacrifice, one that ultimately served the greater good by enabling the development of a system that, whilst rooted in irrationality, would evolve into a rational order of progress and prosperity. It was men's submission to the impersonal forces of the market that, in the past, has made possible the growth of a civilization which, without this, could not have developed. It is by thus submitting that we are every day helping to build something that is greater than any one of us can fully comprehend. It does not matter whether men in the past did submit from beliefs which some now regard as superstitious, from a religious spirit of humility, or an exaggerated respect for the crude teachings of the early economists. In perceiving a world still defined by irrationality and impending existential threats to human existence, Hayek claims that a mimesis of rationality among those most durable to market forces will bleed out irrationality from the masses through restless competition, revealing that only those most rational will ultimately prevail in society. This competitive process, according to Hayek, acts as a natural filter that separates the more rational individuals from those who are less adaptable and more likely to succumb to the threats upon society. As those more rational individuals rise to prominence and influence through their success in the market, their behaviors, strategies, and decisions become sanctified as model ways of life and thought for others to mimic and follow, as Hayek declares that competition will make it necessary for people to act rationally in order to maintain themselves. It is based not on the assumption that most or all the participants in the market process are rational, but, on the contrary, on the assumption that it will, in general, be through competition that a few relatively more rational individuals will make it necessary for the rest to emulate them in order to prevail. In a society in which rational behavior confers an advantage on the individual, rational methods will progressively be developed and be spread by imitation. Competition is as much a method for breeding certain types of mind as anything else. The very cast of thinking of the great entrepreneurs would not exist but for the environment in which they developed their gifts. As consistent with biopolitical modernity, rationality is elevated to the highest level of conscious apprehension as the accumulation and expenditure of capital becomes the center through which human life is organized and understood. From the establishment of this biopolitical subjectivity, mathematical abstractions and empirical analysis become the primary tools through which human existence and the material world is experienced, as everyday items and objects are permeated with market values and indicators, ultimately revealing a world that is increasingly measured, quantified and deciphered in relation to the ordering of the free market. This logic of numbers, calculations, efficiency, and measurable outcomes permeate every aspect of life, from individual decision-making to the structure of society itself. Human value and progress are no longer defined by subjective or cultural markers, but are instead determined by the seemingly objective, information-driven imperatives of free market rationality. For Hayek, those who adhere to such a form of rational consciousness will be the catalysts for societal progress, driven by their commitment to entrepreneurial productivity and efficient innovation. This superior rational minority, in turn, will guide the irrationally complacent majority by shaping their behavior through a process of relentless imitation, ultimately leading them onto the path of progress. Using the example of the European peasant, Hayek argues that their way of life has become obsolete in the face of a more rational urban mode of existence, and as a result, they are no longer capable of contributing to the progress they once historically helped sustain. From which he proclaims that many of the peasants of Europe, particularly those in the remote mountain valleys, cherish their way of life, though it has become a dead end. It has become too dependent on urban civilization, which is continually changing to preserve itself. Yet, the conservative peasant, as much as anybody else, owes his way of life to a different type of person, to men who were innovators in their time, and who, by their innovations, forced a new manner of living on people belonging to an earlier state of culture. According to Hayek, the sustenance of a competitive market order fundamentally relies on the denial, postponement, frustration, and repression of unfulfilled desires. This artificial separation of fulfillment maintains a libidinal apparatus that intermittently manifests within rational economic agents, strategically inducing and stimulating painful desires of envy that can only be satisfied through participation in the system of the market order. As Hayek declares, it is also not part of the general interest that every private desire be met. The order of the great society does rest and must rest on constant, undesigned frustrations of some efforts which ought not to have been made but in free men can be discouraged only by failure. A society fueled by the circulation of endless arousal, therefore, selects and organizes varied patterns of psychological pain as targeted mechanisms of control, conditioning individuals to internalize frustration and resentment as an inherent and necessary part of societal and economic participation, thereby perpetuating cycles of desire, competition, and consumption for the production and reproduction of wealth and progress. For Hayek, the intensification of desire necessitates a fervent inequality in material wealth, where luxury, leisure, abundance, and aesthetic refinement are reserved for a select elite, those who have demonstrated their success within the market order in attaining a higher plane of human existence. From this privileged position, the elite not only shape the broader cultural, consumer, and economic landscape, but also set the trajectory of aspiration for the masses. Always one step ahead, the elite continuously redefine define and project new desires, ensuring that the majority remain in a state of perpetual striving, chasing an ever-receding horizon of material wealth and fulfillment. As Hayek reaffirms that only from an advanced position does the next range of desires and possibilities become visible, so that the selection of new goals and the effort toward their achievement will begin long before the majority can strive for them. If what they will want after their present goals are realized is soon to be made available, it is necessary that the developments that will bear fruit for the masses in 20 or 50 years' time should be guided by the views of people who are already in the position of enjoying them. For Hayek, the quintessential embodiment of this pioneering ethos is the playboy, an individual who artistically creates and experiments with new modes of prestigious living, sculpting new ideals and continuously replenishing the standards of aspirational lifestyles. Many of these artistic, cultural, and intellectually superior qualities of a pioneering elite would also be reflected in the novels and broader philosophy of Ayn Rand, who perceived the elite as a vanguard of civilizational creation and the driving force behind human reason and progress. For Rand, this elite, comprised of innovators, entrepreneurs, and uncompromising visionaries, act as the architects of a world shaped by unceasing rationality, individualism, and productive achievement, forging new values that elevate humanity to higher planes of existence, all whilst resisting the mediocrity and parasitism of the masses. In the 21st century, the intensification of desire has formidably increased with new technological mediums that relentlessly curate visuals of luxury, perfection, excellence, and celebrity status, creating a constant stream of technologically induced stimulations that amplify individual consumer yearnings. These platforms, through social media, advertising, and digital entertainment, showcase an ever-expanding array of material possessions, lifestyles, and personal achievements, cultivating a digital landscape where comparison, consumption, and the pursuit of unattainable objects and ideals are reflected back into society and become integral to modern neoliberal subjectivity. As consistent with Hayek's theories of desire and biopolitical governance, those who are capable of achieving and presenting such elite forms of existence generate not only specific regimes of life and thought, but actively filter out alternatives, ensuring the hegemony of their values, standards, and aspirations across a given society. In arguing that the Western world has overcome the absolute poverty typically associated with the Global South, and that minor state assistances ensure certain degrees of stability to prevent ruptures in the market ordering of society, Hayek nevertheless proclaims that certain limits on individual liberties and societal protections are necessary to prevent idleness and unproductivity within society at large. According to Hayek, more egalitarian approaches to determining societal welfare are counterproductive in their leveling out of human requirements, which discourages individual initiative and undermines personal responsibility. By providing indiscriminate assistance, such approaches reduce the incentives for individuals to plan, save, and work towards their own self-sufficiency, ultimately stifling the competition, innovation, and meritocracy that drive societal progress. Nobody capable of useful work need today lack food and shelter in the advanced countries. And for those incapable of themselves earning enough, these necessities are generally provided outside the market. Poverty, in the relative sense, must of course continue to exist outside of any completely egalitarian society. So long as there exists inequality, somebody must be at the bottom of the scale. From here, Hayek claims that any state intervention to equalize the social hierarchy prevents the mechanisms of the market order from determining positive and negative feedback loop cycles, therefore stifling the market's inherent knowledge on how to allocate resources efficiently and adapt to changing conditions. Such interventions, according to Hayek, disrupt the natural processes through which the market reveals the most productive, innovative, and rational behaviors of individuals. Additionally, as individuals make choices in reference to their children or possible future descendants, those at the lower end of the social hierarchy further bear the consequences of their ancestors' misfortunate decisions and choices. As Hayek declares, parents in their choice of a place to live or of their occupation usually consider the effects their decisions will have on the prospects of their children, is an important factor in the adaptation of the use of human resources to foreseeable future developments. But so long as the individual is free to make such decisions, these considerations will be taken into account only if the risk is borne not only by those who decide, but also by their descendants. In this sense, the feelings of shame, indignity, and failure are to be felt across entire family lineages, providing the necessary impetus for individuals to rationally overcome the misfortunes of their ancestors. Central to this process is, according to Hayek, the partition between the city and its peripheral urban slums, which will contain the masses most incapable of contributing to the market order within the urban core, crucially marking the urban slums as economic and infrastructural deterrents to prevent the fears of overpopulation within cities. As Hayek reaffirms, a part of the slum population of most cities consists of old inhabitants who know only city life and who would be even less able to earn an adequate living in rural conditions. But the more acute problem is that raised by the influx of large numbers from poorer and still predominantly rural regions, to whom the cheap accommodation in the old and decaying buildings of the city offers a foothold on the ladder that may lead to greater prosperity. They find it to their advantage to move into the city in spite of the crowded and unsanitary conditions in which they have to live. Providing them with much better quarters at an equally low cost will attract a great many more. The solution of the problem would be either to let the economic deterrents act or to control directly the influx of population. Those who believe in liberty will regard the former as the lesser evil. Similar to Hayek's biopolitical stance on social welfare, the deliberate non-intervention in infrastructural replenishment serves as a mechanism to distinguish those most capable of enduring and overcoming the unsanitary, destitute, and immiserated conditions of urban slums. At the same time, this strategic neglect ensures that the impoverished remain contained outside of productive city centers, suspended in a liminal state between survival and obsolescence, where only the most resilient may find a path to rewarding societal and economic participation. An individual's position within the class hierarchy of society, therefore, determines their value in terms of usefulness and uselessness, as the values associated with productivity, self-sufficiency, and economic contribution are rendered as the highest markers of societal worth, in contrast to those deemed dependent, unproductive, or inefficient, who are relegated to the margins of economic life and existence. The spectacle of human immiseration and the possibilities of death are further aligned with Hayek's biopolitical logic on the valuing of human life, from which, accordingly, certain members of a given society are to be more willingly sacrificed if they do not meet the utilitarian demands of the market order. Whilst Hayek justifies the free market's existence on the basis of maximizing life on the largest possible scale, his argument simultaneously implies a hierarchy of human worth, from which he asserts that certain individuals, particularly those who align with market utility, are more capable of sustaining and generating life on a broader scale than those who do not align to market utility, revealing a division between those deemed more worthy of life and preservation and those deemed worthy of greater neglect and disposability. As Hayek declares of his biopolitical logic, that only unknown lives will count as so many units when it is a question of sacrificing a few lives in order to serve a larger number elsewhere. The requirement of preserving the maximum number of lives is not that all individual lives be regarded as equally important. It may be more important to save the life of the doctor than to save the lives of any particular one of his patients. Otherwise, none might survive. Some lives are evidently more important in that they create or preserve other lives. In making specific remarks on such unknown lives the market must let live or let die, Hayek claims that the old and mortally ill, who have used up their productive capacities, should be more easily disposed of, to ensure that resources are put towards those most fit and viable in their existence, towards the service of a market order. Ultimately, this logic ensures that potential death serves life in its most productive capacities, where the preservation of existence is not an inherent human value, but rather a function of market necessity. Those deemed unproductive or burdensome are filtered out, not through direct intervention, but through the implicit mechanisms of market selection, which dictate the allocation of medical, infrastructural, and economic resources. Under Hayek's biopolitical logic, therefore, death is not mere individual fate, but a functional imperative within the self-regulating system of the market, ensuring the continuous circulation of resources and the preservation of economic efficiency. Crucially, Hayek's broader economic philosophy, grounded in market fundamentalism and biopolitical governance, produces eugenic-like effects by structuring human society around the survival of those deemed most economically capable, whilst establishing a hierarchy of human utility, which enables the market to distinguish between useful and disposable forms of life, reinforcing a system in which worth is measured by one's submission to market productivity and hegemony. From Hayek's admiration of elite pioneers with superior qualities, who, in his view, shaped the very conditions of life itself, to his opposition of universal justice and his acceptance of strategically inflicted pain and frustration as necessary disciplinary functions, his vision of modern capitalism reveals an inherent drive to master human life and coercively mold it to meet the demands of a market order, all whilst ensuring that the human psyche internalizes notions of success and failure, fundamentally embedding one's position within the class hierarchy as a deeply felt psychophysiological experience. This optimism of denial and subtle forms of violence and cruelty, according to the scholars Lauren Berlant and Wendy Brown, creates a sadism of everyday life, from which individuals are compelled to endure systemic hierarchies of inequality, rationalize their own suffering as personal failure, and participate in a cycle of unceasing self-discipline towards a phantasm of unattainable material success that only reinforces the very structures of such hierarchical relations. Whilst Hayek was writing largely in the mid-20th century, his vision for the restructuring of society under uncompromising market hegemony would find its full expression in the rise of neoliberalism in the late 20th century, notably under the governments of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Indeed, from its coercive and militarized inception in the early 1970s Chile, Hayek viewed Pinochet's regime as a necessary precondition for establishing a flourishing neoliberal market order. Although he expressed reservations about the regime's more overtly authoritarian tendencies, he nonetheless defended its role in advancing economic liberalization. In a 1981 interview with the Chilean media platform El Mercurio, Hayek famously stated that he would prefer a liberal dictatorship to a democratic government devoid of liberalism, emphasizing that market freedoms took precedence over democratic values. Since then, Hayek's theories and broader philosophical framework have been adopted across much of the modern world, influencing financial economic practices, governmental structures, and global market systems and institutions, particularly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The events following Pinochet's initial rule can therefore be understood through the lens of Hayek's philosophy, as part of a continuing evolutionary process aimed at enacting eugenic-like effects, systematically engineering a new global social order for the prosperity of a newly refined capitalist system. In other words, it represents a biopolitical form of selective pressure designed to shape human existence in the image of neoliberal capitalism. Whilst Hayek saw the individual as a potentially rational economic agent who perseveres through unequal conditions in their mimicry of elite ways of life and thought, so as to meritocratically obtain wealth and material sufficiency through adherence to the spontaneous order of the market without state support. The realities of neoliberalism in the current day reveal the rather opposite results for large sectors of humanity across the globe, as wealth inequality, poverty, debt, and homelessness, in spite of higher laboring productivity, have significantly increased in the first half of the 21st century. Additionally, neoliberalism has facilitated the large-scale exploitation of the Earth's natural resources, all while simultaneously stripping the global working class of the essential assets required to resist unbridled class warfare from billionaire elites. Where Hayek envisioned the market as a force that promotes free competition and thrives without state intervention, neoliberalism has instead facilitated the rise of corporate monopolies and oligopolies, which are often enabled by the powers of the state. Whilst Hayek championed entrepreneurial productivity and individual liberty as pathways to human flourishing, free markets have concentrated wealth in the hands of a privileged few, while expanding surveillance systems that erode personal autonomy. And whereas Hayek believed in the spontaneous allocation of resources through market mechanisms, neoliberalism has redirected resources away from essential public needs and towards the wealthiest, reinforcing authoritarian measures to safeguard such elite interests. In all such cases, Hayek's broader economic philosophy has failed to deliver the prosperity it claimed to offer for humanity, and has accelerated conditions antithetical to life itself. While some argue that Hayek's economic philosophy should be distinguished from the realities of neoliberalism in the current day, the Italian Marxist philosopher Maurizio Lazzarato contends that this view ignores the eugenic-like tendencies embedded in Hayek's writings, from which such tendencies align with the material manifestations of violence and power that were necessary to establish neoliberal societies and dispose of worker-aligned socialist or communist alternatives, a process which, according to Lazzarato, has continued into the present. Furthermore, the legacy of Hayek's theories, alongside those of early neoliberal thinkers like Ludwig von Mises and Milton Friedman, has extended far beyond the realm of economics, shaping and exacerbating crises across social, political, and ecological domains, as the environmentalists George Monbiot and Peter Hutchinson declare in their 2024 book titled The Invisible Doctrine: The Secret History of Neoliberalism, that neoliberalism has caused or contributed to most of the crises that now confront us: rising inequality, rampant child poverty, epidemic diseases of despair, offshoring and erosion of the tax base, the slow degradation of healthcare, education and other public services, the crumbling of infrastructure, democratic backsliding, the 2008 financial crash, the rise of modern-day demagogues, our ecological crises and environmental disasters. So pervasive has neoliberalism become that we no longer even recognize it as an ideology. We see it as a kind of natural law, like Darwinian selection, thermodynamics, or even gravity, an immutable fact, a non-negotiable reality. Although believed to be grounded in liberal, humanist, and democratic principles, neoliberalism has since paved way and even directly produced authoritarian, oligarchic, and neo-fascist movements and regimes that strongly intersect with neoliberal practices and the values first set out in the writings of Friedrich Hayek. From Putin's Russia to Trump's America, such regimes, in spite of their respective differences and approaches to governance, reinforce the central tenets of neoliberal theories: deregulation, privatization, elitism, and market adherence, all while simultaneously deploying authoritarian measures to suppress dissent, consolidate power, protect elite interests, and maintain class discrepancies. This paradoxical fusion of economic liberalism and political repression demonstrates how neoliberalism, rather than harboring genuine democratic and socio-economic participation, has enabled the rise of oligarchic rule, corporate dominance, and intensified apparatuses of state control under the guise of economic efficiency and individual freedom. The violence and harms of society, spanning centuries of time and across the globe, are the result of the insidious nature of power and the dogmatic hegemonic discourse that fuels and maintains systems of oppression. Neoliberalism and its carceral logic cannot be ignored, as they permeate all aspects of social life as implanted in our everyday lives. This, combined with the current times of divisiveness, the rise of populist, nationalist, and narcissistic leaders promoting themselves through the rhetoric of hatred and enhancing inequalities that further fuel violence, makes the potential for change seem bleak. The protection of elite interests, their increased carceral logics of oppression, and the ongoing efforts to reverse many of the individual rights that have slowly been gained are the only beneficiaries of the current violent neoliberal system. However, as the global expanse of neoliberalism continues to run rampant upon societies and the Earth's delicate ecosystems, new conditions to challenging the seemingly innate hegemony of neoliberal capitalism are emerging across the world, questioning both its foundations and legitimacy, as communities and movements seek to reimagine alternatives that prioritize greater levels of collective well-being, ecological balance, and genuine democratic participation over the perpetuation of global market-driven inequalities that continue to deny, denigrate, and dehumanize the life of the human and its ecological surroundings in the 21st century.